We're going to discuss today the inyan of the Kanim. The Kanim is basically a word which is connected with the Meneda. There is the Shisha Knei HaMeneda, and then there's the seventh one. Basically, this was a project that the Rebbe began in Tafshin Yutes. This is late 1958. And the Rebbe spoke about it a few times. The Rebbe spoke about it by the Yutes Kislev Fabrengen. And the Rebbe spoke about it in the Yechidus earlier. And by Yutes Kislev Fabrengen, at the Fabrengen, the Rebbe actually referred to it, what he mentioned earlier in the Yechidus. And in addition to that, there's also a letter from the Mosquitoes later on in the year, 7th time, in regards to this project. So we'll mention from the various siches of the Rebbe, how the Rebbe referred to it, what the Rebbe's expectations were, and how it developed over the years. I'll first mention the sicha of Vav Kislev, which is the sicha Yechidus for a kvutza of Talmidei Atminim. And then we'll understand the reference that the Rebbe makes to this Yechidus in the Yutes Kislev Fabrengen a few weeks later. In the Yechidus of Vav Kislev, which the Rebbe spoke as mentioned to a kvutza of Talmidei Atmimim, the Rebbe says, Al pi bakoshasi, based on my request, the Anhola has mentioned your names, has listed your names on its sepul, that you as a kvutza, and as each Talmud separately, is shaykh to this project. B'negeya to what? B'negeya to an increase in limud al-Torah. Some of you in Nigla, some of you in Chassidus, each one, although a Bachar is learning both, but some of them, their koch, their hisafa, their expertise is basically Yediyas more in Nigla, and some are in Chassidus. And why they chose that this Bachar is more inclined to Nigla and this one to Chassidus, the Rebbe says, surely they have a reason, Mislama, they have a reason for that. And the Rebbe continues, in this yeshiva, every Bachar is referred to as a Tamim. A Tamim means complete. Complete in what? In Nigla and Chassidus. This is basically what a Tamim is. Limud Nigla, Limud Chassidus together. Teira Tamima, one Teira. And as it was set up in the Sidri HaLimud, that there is a time for Limud Nigla and there's a time for Limud Chassidus. This is the schedule of the yeshiva. So the Rebbe says what we're discussing now is an addition to that. An addition to it, that it has to be additional learning, but not in the time of Seder. Taking off personal time after the Seder, which is in addition to what everybody is obligated to during the Seder, which means this is your personal time, and you can then choose to learn b'maya v'zoyer tvei, in what you have a bigger gishmak, in an inclination. So b'meila, this is a hisofa on limud seder nigla and seder achsidus. And the Rebbe explains that the ikar and the hisofa is not so much the quantity, but the involvement in it, becoming engrossed in it. The simas leiv b'nefesh, that the learning has to be with a chayes and with a liveliness, talebedikait. Another nekuda the Rebbe says, the kavani is here, not only there should be an increase in limud ha-Torah by each one of you, but this should also accomplish a pa'ula on others. You should make an impact also on others. B'hagdoma, the Torah is referred to as bread, as it says, l'chu lachamu b'lachmi, as mentioned in many places in Chassidus. And since it says lachamu b'lachmi, a double, that means nigla the Torah and pnimis ha-Torah. Shebedereinu, that in our generation, this is the inyan of Torah Chassidus. And in the same sense that when it comes to physical bread, there is bread which is made basically from flour and water. So it's not the pshat that every one of these ingredients of the yeast, they're all separate. But the kavani is they all are mixed together. The shmarim, the flour, it gives a taste. It rises. This is the nature of dough. And memela then lechem levav neshisa. There is something that satisfies the person. In the same sense, it is in our case that the kavani is that the increase should be not only by you, but the limud anigla chassidus needs to be with such a gishmak and such an excitement that it should be tefeach amanas latfiach, that it should also have an impact on others. Say in the higher classes and say in the lower grades, and say in your class, in your kita itself, bacharim that are not yet doing it outside in addition to the Seder. Which means there's a Peil na Aufgehebenkeit, that's the Lashon der Rebbe, Hagboa Isnasus of Kedusha. Limud HaTeira in a way of Yagdu Teira v'Yader, being also mashpia on others. And the Rebbe concludes the Yechidus, the Eibishter should help, that you should have Atzlacha in Limud HaNigla in Yiras Shamayim and fulfilling mitzvahs Behidur, which this is the Tachlis HaMekuvim, that the Limud has to come down in Maisa. God will Talmud maybe Lidei Maisa. So the main thing is the Inyan of the Maisa. Till the expression of Maisa, Maisa also means forcing oneself, doing the Inyan of Iskafia, that the Talmud brings a person to a Inyan of Maisa, including also refining oneself. That's the Inyan of Iskafia. In a way that it should accomplish and have an impact everywhere. And the Eibishter should help, that should already begin from now with the success of Limud HaTeira and Yiras Shamayim and Shkida and Al-Smada, which means basically being engrossed in Limud HaTeira. And it came Amitzes Behider, B'Simchov Tulivov, in a way of Bufaratzna. Which kedai to mention that this is the year that the Rebbe sich stark gekocht in Dinyan of Bufaratzna, very strongly mentioning it in Sichas quite often, and demanding it, say from Bacharim and say from Younger Light, as we see it in the Sichas a little later on in the year. Now we go on to 13 days later, where the Rebbe, at the Fabringen of Yutas Kislev, makes reference to this Yechidus. So the Rebbe says, B'shayches to this, there are those that volunteered that their anhogin Limud HaNigla, Limud HaChassidus will be in a way of chutza, higher and outside of limitations. What does it mean outside of limitations? Outside of Sidrei HaYeshiva, in addition to Sidrei HaYeshiva. Although the yeshiva in its curriculum does not demand it, but still a person goes beyond it. A sof, an increase of Sidrei HaYeshiva. And the Rebbe says this sof does not need to be a big kamos, big quantity, although it's not less than what they're learning in yeshiva. But it's al derech like Hashena Pirke Meya Pa'amim, and then there's Meya Ve'echad. Ein Eidema. You can't compare one that's learning 100 times and one that's learning 101 times. As we have it in the Gemara Chagiga and in Tanya, that there's a difference between 100 and 101. What is the difference? 100 was the natural pattern. Routine. Those times they would learn everything 100 times to remember it, because the Svarim were not published. Gemaras were not published. Someone learns beyond it, even if it's one more time. But since it is not his usual pattern, his usual Seder, so this is Shalei Be'erech to the 100 times. So the Rebbe says, although Bekamos it's one Pamachas, still it weighs over the 100 times, because he's breaking his own natural pattern that he learns everything 100 times. So therefore, it breaks through the limitations of his individual world. And the Mela, through this, the Rebbe says, they will break through the limitations of also the Chaverim, who they're learning with, till the limitations of the Mesed in where they're learning, that despite all the Halamas Vesteda, despite all the concealments, it will be fulfilled, the Ratzon and Kavanah Pnimis of the Miyazdim, the Menalim, the Rabbeim. And the Rebbe concludes that everyone who volunteered should say L'chaim, on the Hemshech Le'Sofer Lazeh, that first they should say it should be Chaim for those that are the Sheva Knei HaMeneda, the 7 for Nigla de Teira and the 7 for Pnimis HaTeira, Teiras HaChassidus. Which this is the Sikha of Yutas Kislev, how the Rebbe really is me'eder and brings out the uniqueness of a Sofer and Limud HaTorah. Now we're going to go to a letter that the Maskiros, actually it was a letter of the Maskiros, who wrote to the yeshiva in Lud, Temchikmim in Lud, on the 12th of Sivan Tavshin Yutes. This is months later. So the Maskiros writes that in a specific parcel, mail parcel package, we're sending to you the Kevitz Pilpul HaTalmidim that just went out Erev Chag HaShavuos. Just to give a little background, that these Kanim were responsible to say Pilpulim. And when I was a Bacher in the Lametz, we saw every week there was one Kan in Nigla that said an Inyan in Nigla, and one said in Chassidus. So it was like alternating every 7 weeks. Summer, the one in Nigla said Friday before the end of the Seder. Winter, it would be Mitzvah Shabbos. The one in Chassidus said Friday night in winter. So basically, this is how it went. They were responsible to say Pilpulim. They were known as the Kanim, 7 Nigla, 7 Chassidus. So here we're speaking about the Pilpul HaTalmidim, which started to come out then, already actually before in Tavshin Yud Zayin. It seems like the Rebbe is already urging to publish Pilpulim, although by Chassidim there was no union of writing Chidushim, but the Rebbe broke through this Hagbola and impression and urged very much that Bacharim should write Pilpulim, Chidush Torah. And as we see it in Tavshin Mem, the Rebbe urged that at least twice a year, not only Kanim, but twice a year, there should be kevtzim of Chidush Torah. So in this letter, they mentioned, the Maskiros mentions that the kevitz consists of 7 inyanim and nigla, 7 chassidus that was said by 14 talmidim, which beginning of the Chedesh Kislev of this year, which is, as mentioned earlier, Tavshin Yutes, the Rebbe suggested that the 2 kvutzes, in addition to the learning in Seder HaYeshiva, they should also devote themselves to limud in a way of ufaratzta, breaking through the limitations. And then the Maskiros mentions briefly that the details about the founding of these kvutzes and the format of their learning, their commitment to learning, the chulu and their hatzlacha, surely you know already, al pi hashemur. In other words, it got to you already somehow, the details about this project. And therefore, we suggest to you that you should also make 2 kvutzes amongst your talmidim. Move on, that the chosen talmidim should be those that are appropriate for this. And that they're doing it not because they're forced, but from their goodwill and from their own will. And the number 7 is not necessarily, it could be more. And after you will set up these kvutzes, surely you will watch what is going on here, and you will follow that one bacha says in Nigla, one says in Chassidus, everyone according to his kvutzah, and then they will record it in writing, and b'meila then they will be able to publish it, either in a specific kavitz or in a general kavitz. I would figure that the word shiva not necessarily means that it can be more. The chayra, I wouldn't figure that it means less. Now, these kvutzes, as I mentioned earlier, went very strong. I mean, in the early Lameds, in the early 70s, it was like a clock. Nigla, Chassidus. One kind of Nigla, one kind of Chassidus. Picked any subject he wanted and spoke a whole pilpul. Even in Chassidus, there was a whole shaklavitaria, there was a whole pilpul, either to answer a question that Lacheda shows on a contradiction between one place and another place in Chassidus v'chulo. When sie gewinnen alle Lebedigkeit, there were Bacharim that asked questions, v'chulo. The Chavivos, just conclude with a personal experience. The Chavivos that the Rebbe had b'chlal to Pilpulim, which also, when we learned in Ocean Parkway, this is Behemshech to Bedford and Dean, the Lubavitcher Yeshiva, so there was also a Pilpul once a week. It was in Tavshin Lamed 1970, a few weeks before Yud Shvat. It was my turn to say a Pilpul. The Teichen of the Pilpul was saying Tosem Alech Melech. It was in Ksubes, Daf Yud Zayin. And usually a copy of the Maramikemus would go into the Rebbe, another copy would be going to the Menayel of the yeshiva, Rabbi Tenenbaum Alav Shalom, and the copy is hanging on the wall. I came home one of the days in the evening. My father tells me the Rebbe spoke to him and asked him that since he heard that there was that I said a pilpul, he wanted to know if it was Batzlacha and if the Tzemach Tzedek was mentioned. The Rebbe earlier already, I think from Tavshan Chav Gimel, asked that the Tzemach Tzedek should be mentioned in any pilpul that Bacharim say the Tzemach Tzedek should be mentioned, either from Mishalas and Shuves or Chidushim al Hashas, v'chulu. Tzemach Tzedek actually was mentioned. It was like a remote place in Shalas and Shuves in Even Ezer where I found something about this inyan in Ksuvas. And actually in later years, Chassidim started to mention inyanim from the Rebbe. And today, it is an inyan that when a person says a pilpul, he brings in the Rebbe, which I'm sure from the many, many svarim that we have from the Rebbe, there is something that can always be connected to that sugya, that gemara, v'chulu. The Rebbe says a helfen that you should have atzlacha rabbe umafloga, we should have psuris tevis one from another, and we should have the gula mitis v'hashlema.